He never believed a single glance could change the course of his life. For years, Ethan Ward had walked into glittering rooms filled with the powerful and the ambitious. Yet every conversation, every smile, every glass raised in his honor felt hollow. Tonight, the gala atop the Solstice Tower was no different, or so he thought. The skyline of Manhattan sparkled below, an endless ocean of lights. The rooftop was alive with laughter, clinking glasses, and carefully rehearsed words of people trying to impress one another. It was a theater of wealth, and Ethan played his role well. His suit was immaculate, his stride confident, his reputation preceding him. Whispers followed him through the crowd: the self-made millionaire, the man who had built an empire from nothing. Yet inside, he carried an emptiness no applause could fill. As he moved among the guests, shaking hands and exchanging polite words, he felt the weight of solitude pressing down. Success had given him everything the world told him he should want: money, status, recognition, but had stolen something along the way: meaning. He stood in the midst of admiration, yet felt invisible. That was when he saw her. Across the room, moving quietly among the guests, was a young woman who clearly didn't belong to this world of gold and glass. Her black and white uniform marked her as staff, but her presence carried a dignity that silenced the noise in his mind. She wasn't like the others, those who craved attention, who lived for the sparkle of being noticed. She moved with grace, balancing a tray of glasses with care, her steps light but steady. Her beauty was not the kind adorned with diamonds or gowns, but something more profound, unassuming, radiant in its simplicity. Ethan's gaze locked on her as though the rest of the room had dissolved. When their eyes met, just for a flicker, he felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Her gaze wasn't filled with the hunger he was used to. It wasn't awe, nor was it fear. It was steady, questioning, almost as if she were seeing not the millionaire, but the man behind the title. That single glance was enough to shake the walls he had built around himself. He told himself it was ridiculous. She was just a waitress at a gala, a stranger he would likely never see again. But the more he tried to pull his attention back to the conversations swirling around him, the more impossible it became. She passed through the crowd like a shadow, careful and unnoticed by most, but to Ethan she was the only presence that mattered. The music played on, the lights glittered, deals were whispered in corners, yet all he could hear was the echo of that unspoken connection. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a pull stronger than ambition, stronger than money, a pull toward something unknown but undeniably real. He drifted toward the quieter edges of the rooftop, away from the polished smiles and sharp suits, hoping to catch another glimpse. And there she was again, setting down a tray with practiced care, a strand of hair falling against her cheek. Without thinking, he stepped into her path. She looked up, startled but not flustered, her eyes meeting his once more. The silence between them stretched, fragile yet electric. "Do you serve coffee?" His voice carried a quiet humor, though even he wasn't sure why he asked. Perhaps he only wanted her to pause, to stay a moment longer in his orbit. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, the kind that revealed more than words ever could. "Not here," she replied softly, her voice steady yet kind. "But if you'd like water, I can bring that." It was such a simple exchange, but it lingered in him like an echo. He had spent years surrounded by people who spoke in strategies and transactions. Yet here was someone who answered with honesty, stripped of pretense. He found himself wanting to ask her name, wanting to know what world she belonged to when she wasn't carrying trays through glittering halls. She stepped away to continue her work, but something had shifted. Ethan watched her go, the question pressing against his chest like an unspoken vow. Who was this woman? And why did it feel like destiny had placed her here tonight? The gala continued, but for Ethan, it had already changed. He no longer cared about the investors or the conversations waiting for him. All he could think about was the girl with steady eyes and quiet grace, who had unknowingly reminded him that even in a life surrounded by everything, he was still searching for something real. And deep within, he sensed this was only the beginning. The next morning, sunlight spilled into Ethan's penthouse like liquid gold, reflecting off glass walls and polished floors. The city stretched endlessly below, a living machine of ambition and movement. But Ethan sat alone at the edge of his long dining table, with untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. His mind wasn't on the buzzing markets or the contracts waiting for his signature. It wasn't on the countless messages that lit up his phone. It was on a single fleeting moment, a pair of steady eyes, a quiet smile that seemed to cut through the noise of everything he thought he wanted. He told himself it was absurd. He didn't even know her name. She was a stranger in a crowded room, a face that should have already blended into memory. And yet she hadn't. He remembered the way she moved with a kind of humility he rarely saw in the world he lived in. He remembered how, when she spoke, it wasn't rehearsed or laced with calculation. It was honest, real. That word real was one he hadn't tasted in years. Ethan had built his empire on sharp instincts, on chasing opportunities no one else saw. And now those same instincts whispered that their meeting had not been chance. He couldn't explain it, but he felt as though he had been standing at the edge of something for a long time. And she was the first person who had made him want to take a step forward. The thought unsettled him, and yet he couldn't shake it. For the rest of the day, he moved through his obligations like a ghost. Meetings blurred together, numbers flashed across screens, but all of it was noise compared to the single image that replayed in his mind. By evening, when the city began to glow again under the night sky, he found himself doing something he never did, returning to the Solstice Tower. The gala was long over, the rooftop quiet, but he knew that staff often lingered to clean and prepare for the next event. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. When he stepped into the service corridor behind the glittering hall, he caught sight of her again. She was stacking glasses carefully, her movements patient, deliberate, as if each fragile piece mattered. This time, he didn't hesitate. "Excuse me," he said softly. She turned, a little surprised, but recognition flickered in her gaze. The man from the gala, the one who had asked about coffee. For a moment, silence stretched again between them, filled only by the quiet clink of glass. "I never got your name," Ethan said, his voice lower than usual, almost careful. She studied him for a second, as though deciding whether to answer. "Clara," she said at last. "Clara Hayes." The name settled in his chest like an anchor. He repeated it quietly, not to her but to himself, as if committing it to memory. "Clara, and you?" she asked, though her tone carried no sign of being impressed or awed. "Ethan," he replied simply. He didn't Edward. He didn't tell her who he was or what empire he had built. For once, he wanted to be only a man speaking to a woman, nothing more. Something about that moment felt different from everything else in his life. Clara didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't fawn or flatter. She only nodded and returned to her task, and somehow that steadiness drew him even closer. "Do you always work these events?" he asked, leaning against the counter nearby. "Most of them," she said. "It helps with tuition." Ethan tilted his head. "School." "College," she confirmed. "Nursing." Her voice softened as she said it, a hint of both pride and weariness in the words. He watched her hands, steady and sure even after a long night, and something inside him stirred again. A life of service, a dream that wasn't built on wealth or recognition, but on helping others. It was so far from the world he knew, and yet it felt more meaningful than anything he had built. The more she spoke, the more Ethan realized he wanted to listen. He wanted to know what she dreamed of, what she feared, what she loved, and for the first time in years, he felt his own guarded walls beginning to crack. But even as he lingered in that quiet service corridor, he knew there was something dangerous about what he was feeling. He had spent a lifetime controlling everything: deals, risks, even people. But this connection wasn't something he could control. It was something deeper, something that might change him in ways he wasn't ready to admit or still. As Clara excused herself to carry another tray, her steps light but firm, Ethan found himself making a silent promise. He wasn't going to let this be just another fleeting moment. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to see her again. And as he walked out of the tower into the cool night air, he realized he wasn't just thinking about her anymore. He was feeling something he had long thought impossible, a spark of hope, fragile but alive. Asterisk. Ethan couldn't forget the sound of her name. It lingered in his mind like a quiet melody, replaying even in the middle of meetings. Even in the silence of his penthouse at night, Clara. He had met countless people in his life, more names than he could remember, but hers had carved itself into him in a way he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was because she had looked at him without expectation, without calculation. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in years, he felt like a man instead of a symbol. Whatever the reason, he found himself seeking her presence again and again. The following week, he returned to the Solstice Tower under the guise of business. Though in truth it was not contracts or deals that drew him back, he noticed her almost immediately. Clara moving gracefully through the crowd, her expression calm despite the chaos of the event. He watched from a distance at first, observing how she navigated the room with quiet determination. Every step she took seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if she were carrying not just trays of glasses, but the weight of her own unseen battles. When he finally approached, she greeted him with a small, knowing smile. Not the kind of smile that said she was impressed by him, but one that carried recognition, as though she had already accepted his presence in her world. He found himself relaxing in that smile, his usual guardedness slipping away. "You're here again," she said softly. "Balancing a tray, and you're still carrying half the room," he replied, his tone lighter than usual. Her eyes flickered with amusement. "That's my job." He could have left it at that, but something urged him to continue. "What about outside of here? What do you do when you're not serving 100 glasses in one night?" The question seemed to surprise her. Most people didn't ask. Most people didn't care. Clara hesitated before answering, her gaze shifting briefly toward the glittering skyline beyond the glass walls. "I study. Nursing takes most of my time. When I'm not working here, I'm either at school or at the hospital for training." Ethan felt something stir inside him again. She wasn't just working to get by, she was building something greater, something selfless. He admired that, even envied it. She had a purpose beyond herself, while he, with all his wealth and power, often felt like he was running in circles chasing shadows. "And when you do have time for yourself?" He pressed gently. Clara tilted her head as though the question itself was foreign. "I read, walk by the river sometimes. Simple things." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "And you? What do you do when you're not surrounded by people in suits?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected polite interest, but there was sincerity in her voice, a genuine curiosity. For a moment, he didn't know how to answer. He thought about his life, the endless meetings, the empty penthouse, the hollow parties that felt like obligations. What did he do when he wasn't wearing the mask of the successful man? The silence stretched as he realized he had no real answer. Finally, he said, "I don't think I've figured that out yet." Clara's gaze softened. She didn't respond with judgment or pity, only a quiet nod, as though she understood. That small gesture unsettled him more than any negotiation ever had. It was the first time in years someone had seen through him, without him having to explain. From that night on, Ethan began to seek her out deliberately. Sometimes it was at the events where she worked, sometimes in the quiet service corridors afterward. Each time, he learned a little more. Clara lived with a determination that humbled him. She juggled late-night shifts with early morning classes, her dreams sustained not by luxury but by resilience. She spoke of her younger brother with a tenderness that revealed the weight she carried on her shoulders. She rarely complained, but Ethan could see the fatigue in her eyes, the sacrifices hidden beneath her quiet strength. In her presence, he found himself speaking truths he had buried for years. He told her about the emptiness that haunted his success, about how he had built everything he thought he wanted only to realize it wasn't enough. She listened, not with the eagerness of someone trying to use his vulnerability, but with the patience of someone who genuinely cared. It was disarming. The more time he spent with Clara, the more he realized how different their worlds were, and yet, how much he needed the connection she offered. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about expanding his empire or outmaneuvering competitors. He was thinking about the quiet steadiness of a woman who saw him as a man, not a millionaire. But as their bond grew, so did an unspoken tension. Ethan knew there would come a moment when their differences, the gap between his world and hers, would press against them. He knew the simplicity he longed for could not erase the complexity of who he was. And yet, every time he looked into her steady eyes, he felt that maybe, just maybe, the impossible was worth chasing. The question haunted him as he left her side one evening, the city humming below. Could a man who had everything but meaning find his purpose in someone who had nothing but dreams? The answer, he knew, would change both their lives forever. The night he finally decided to step into her world. Ethan felt something in him stir that he hadn't known in years' anticipation. The kind that carried both fear and hope. For weeks he had lingered at the edges of Clara's life, catching stolen conversations, small moments shared in the shadows of glittering events. He had learned her laugh was quiet but genuine, that she carried books in her bag alongside trays of glasses, that she moved through exhaustion with a grace most people would never notice. But he also knew that words whispered in service corridors weren't enough. If he truly wanted to know her, he had to go where her real life unfolded. It began with a question. "When's your next day off?" he asked one evening after another gala, when she was stacking plates in the service kitchen. His tone was light, but his eyes carried more weight than the words alone. Clara paused, narrowing her gaze slightly. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I'd like to see you somewhere that isn't covered in champagne and glass." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, though he could see the hesitation in her eyes. "I don't exactly spend my time in places you're used to." "Then show me," Ethan said. "Take me there." The silence that followed was long, but at last, Clara nodded. "Saturday. I volunteer at a clinic in Brooklyn. If you're serious, come." He didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." When Saturday came, Ethan found himself driving past neighborhoods he hadn't set foot in for years. The shining towers of Manhattan gave way to narrow streets, weathered storefronts, and apartment buildings where life pressed hard against the walls. The clinic was tucked between a laundromat and a small grocery store, its sign faded, its door worn. Yet inside it pulsed with energy. Nurses moved quickly, volunteers guided patients, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and determination. Clara was there, her hair tied back, her simple clothes a stark contrast to the gown she wore while working events. She moved between patients with the same quiet grace Ethan had first noticed, offering comfort with her presence as much as with her words. She didn't see him at first, and for a moment Ethan simply watched. Here, in this space, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't someone blending into the background. She was light, steady, and sure, holding her own in a world that asked much of her and gave little in return. When she finally noticed him, surprise flickered in her eyes, quickly followed by something softer. "You came," she said. "I told you I would." She studied him for a moment, as though testing the truth in his presence, then gave a small nod. "Come on, if you're here, you're not just watching, you're helping." The hours that followed were unlike anything Ethan had experienced in years. He carried boxes, organized supplies, handed out food to patients waiting in line. It was simple work, yet it struck him harder than any deal he had ever signed. These people didn't care who he was or what empire he had built. To them, he was just another pair of hands, and strangely, it was the most freeing thing he had ever felt. When the day ended, Clara walked him outside into the fading light. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held a depth that made his chest tighten. "I wasn't sure you'd last the whole day," she admitted. "Neither was I," he confessed, and they both laughed quietly. But beneath the laughter, there was something else, an understanding, a shift that neither of them could deny. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly, her voice softer now. "Men like you don't usually come here. They don't see this world." Ethan hesitated, searching for words that matched the truth. "Because I think I've been chasing the wrong things, and when I'm around you, I feel like I'm finally seeing what matters." The words hung between them, raw and unpolished, and Clara's eyes softened in a way that made him feel both exposed and alive. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she simply walked beside him in silence, the weight of his confession settling like a fragile promise. That night, as Ethan drove back to the skyline that had once defined him, he realized something had shifted. He had spent years building towers of glass and steel, but now he had glimpsed a different kind of strength, one built from compassion, resilience, and quiet dignity. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of losing himself in it. Yet even as hope stirred inside him, he knew their story would not be simple. Their worlds were too far apart, the lines between them too sharp, but the pull was undeniable. And the question remained, burning brighter than ever. How far was he willing to go to bridge the distance? Ethan had always believed that power insulated him from the opinions of others. For years, no matter the criticism, he moved forward with the confidence of a man who had built his fortune from nothing. But what he didn't expect was how quickly the world around him began to notice Clara. A single afternoon at the clinic had changed him, yet in the weeks that followed, it began to change the way others looked at him too. It started small questions at board meetings when he arrived late, because he had been driving across the city. His assistants whispered about the evenings he spent away from the usual polished gatherings, and then came the articles. A photograph, snapped without his knowledge, showed him standing outside the clinic with Clara by his side, both of them laughing over something trivial. The picture spread faster than wildfire. The press called it a mystery. Who was the young woman? Why was Manhattan's most eligible millionaire spending time in a forgotten corner of Brooklyn, instead of at a gala in the Upper East Side? His colleagues approached him with raised brows and guarded smiles, pretending their curiosity was friendly when in truth it was edged with judgment. Investors wanted reassurance. Friends from his carefully constructed world wanted explanations. And yet, Ethan found he had none to give. What could he say that for the first time in his life? He felt alive simply carrying boxes in a clinic, beside a woman who reminded him of everything he'd lost along the way. The tension grew sharper when one evening, after a business dinner, an old acquaintance cornered him with a smirk. "You've worked too hard to throw your reputation away on a girl who doesn't belong in our world," the man said casually, as though he were offering advice. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence in his eyes was enough to end the conversation. Still, the words clung to him long after he left. He wondered if Clara knew what people were saying. If she did, she never mentioned it. Her life continued with the same steady rhythm: school, work, the clinic, her brother whom she often spoke of with protective tenderness. Yet Ethan could see the way she sometimes glanced at him with unspoken questions, as though wondering if he understood the weight of stepping into her world. One evening, when the city was wrapped in rain and the streets gleamed with reflections of neon lights, Ethan found himself at Clara's apartment for the first time. It was a small, modest place on the third floor of a weathered building, but it felt warmer than any penthouse he had ever lived in. Books lined the shelves, family photographs were tucked into frames, and the scent of coffee lingered in the air. Clara's younger brother, Daniel, greeted him with curiosity and a shy grin. He was barely a teenager, yet the way he looked at his sister carried a respect far beyond his years. Ethan sat at the small kitchen table as Clara moved about preparing tea. For a moment, he simply watched the way she placed cups on the counter, the way she brushed Daniel's hair from his forehead, the way her presence filled the room with quiet steadiness. It struck him then how different their lives were. His home was filled with silence and shadows. Hers was filled with life. When Clara finally sat across from him, she studied him with calm eyes. "You know they're talking about you," she said quietly. "About us, I know," Ethan admitted. "Does it bother you?" He hesitated, considering the weight of her question. It would have once. "Now, it doesn't matter as much as I thought it would." Her gaze softened, though there was still a trace of concern. "I don't want to be the reason your world turns against you." Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with something raw. "Clara, my world has been against me long before you walked into it. They just disguised it as applause. What I found with you is the first thing that feels honest." The room fell into silence, the rain tapping against the window like a heartbeat. Clara lowered her gaze for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, and then she looked back at him with a quiet intensity. "If you mean that, then you need to understand something. My life isn't easy. It's not polished or glamorous. It's long hours, tired mornings, and sacrifices most people don't see. If you're stepping into it, you can't just step back out when it gets hard." Her words struck him deeper than any challenge he had faced in business. This wasn't a negotiation, wasn't a deal to be made. It was a truth she was laying bare, asking if he had the strength to accept it. Ethan met her gaze and, for the first time, felt the weight of what he was risking. His empire, his reputation, The carefully built image he had lived behind for years, it all felt fragile compared to the possibility of losing the one thing that now gave him hope. "I'm not walking away," he said, his voice low but firm. Clara searched his face, and though doubt lingered in her eyes, so did something else, trust slowly beginning to take root. That night, as Ethan left the warmth of her apartment and stepped back into the rain-soaked streets, he knew the path ahead would not be simple. There would be resistance, whispers, and battles he had never imagined. But he also knew something more certain than any deal he had ever signed for her. For the light she carried into his life, he was willing to face it all. And deep down, he sensed the storm was only just beginning. The storm arrived sooner than Ethan expected. It began with a headline his photograph splashed across the front page of a financial magazine, not celebrating his latest success, but questioning his judgment. "Empire at risk, Ethan Ward's mysterious distraction." The picture showed him leaving Clara's neighborhood, the rain blurring the edges of the frame. But the message was sharp. His empire, they wrote, could not afford his heart. The article spread quickly, followed by calls from investors and partners who feared his focus had shifted. Meetings grew tense, boardrooms colder. Every decision he made was now shadowed by suspicion, as if a single woman had undone years of calculated control. The weight of expectation pressed hard against him, yet every time he thought of walking away to protect what he had built, he saw Clara's eyes steady, unyielding, filled with the quiet truth he could no longer ignore. He tried to shield her from it all, but Clara was not blind. One evening, she stood in her small kitchen, arms folded, watching him pace with the exhaustion of a man torn between two worlds. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You don't have to prove anything to me." Ethan stopped, turning toward her with a look that carried more than words. "Clara, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because of you. Because for the first time in my life, I want something that can't be measured in contracts or numbers. I want something real." Her expression softened, but she shook her head. "Real comes with sacrifice, and I don't want you to wake up one day resenting me for what you lost." He stepped closer, his voice lower now, steady despite the storm raging around him. "The only thing I'll ever resent is if I let fear stop me from holding on to the one thing that's given me hope." The words hung between them, fragile and powerful, and Clara's eyes glistened with something unspoken. She didn't answer, but the way she reached for his hand said more than any reply. Days later, the test came in its harshest form. A board meeting called in haste, voices raised around a long glass table. Men and women in sharp suits spoke of stability, of reputation, of risk. They painted Clara as a distraction, a weakness. One man went so far as to say, "If you want to save everything you've built, you'll need to end whatever this is before it destroys you." Ethan sat in silence, letting their words fall like stones. Once he might have agreed. Once he might have sacrificed anything for the sake of control. But as he lifted his eyes to meet theirs, he realized the empire he had built was not his life, it was only his legacy. And a legacy without meaning was nothing more than dust. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the room with the clarity of a blade. "What I've built stands because I made choices no one else was willing to make. And today, I'm making another one. I won't abandon her. If that costs me your faith, then so be it." The room fell silent, shock painted across every face. For the first time, Ethan felt free not from responsibility, but from the chains of expectation that had bound him for years. That night, he went to Clara, the weight of the decision still heavy, but his heart lighter than it had ever been. She met him at the door, worry etched across her face. Before she could speak, he told her everything: the meeting, the threats, the choice he had made. "You chose me," she whispered, disbelief mingling with fear. "I chose us," he corrected gently. "I chose the truth, because for the first time, I understand that all the power in the world means nothing if I don't have something worth holding on to." Clara's eyes shimmered, and for a long moment, silence wrapped around them. Then, with a trembling voice, she said words he would never forget. "I don't have riches, Ethan. I don't have anything to give you except myself. But if that's enough, then I'll stand by you through everything." In that moment, Ethan felt something he had never felt before, not victory, not triumph, but peace. The kind of peace that comes only when a man stops running from himself and finally embraces what matters. The world outside still doubted him, still whispered, still watched. But as he held Clara close, none of it mattered. He had found what he had been searching for all his life, not in towers of glass or applause of strangers, but in the quiet strength of a woman who carried her own light into his shadows. And though the path ahead was uncertain, Ethan knew with unshakable certainty that he would never walk it alone. For love, in its purest form, had given him something no empire could: the courage to be human, the courage to believe in something greater than himself.